Oh, I gotta tell Andy to take my name off of his.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I am Heidi Rojek from the Downtown Bookstore, Sacramento Books. Welcome to our event this evening. We're glad to have you all here. It doesn't seem like fall yet in Sacramento. We got a nice preview of fall last week and got us all excited for, the holidays and everything. And now we're back up to 90 plus degrees. So, anyway, Shelley's got her fan blowing and I've got my AC behind me again. But anyway, if you don't happen to be from Sacramento, we are a downtown bookstore owned by me and my husband, and we're currently expanding up to the second floor so that we can have even more books for everybody and introduce some discount books upstairs. So we're hoping to, my husband has delusions that we're going to open that on Monday, but I don't know about that. We've been working on it for a while. But anyway, I'm really excited to have Ashley Sweeney here. She's going to be in conversation with Shelley Blanton-Stroud this evening. And Ashley is the author of Answer Creek, and this is her second novel. Answer Creek takes place during the Donner Party era, and it's something that is super interesting to me, and I'm really excited to dive into this book. So you can buy this book at our bookstore. We're open for shopping. We're allowing a limited number of people into the store at one time to keep everybody safe, or you can order online. We do ship books across the country. If you're in town, if you don't want to come into the store, you can do a curbside pickup. We also deliver within 7 miles of the store, so we're very happy to do that. I think that's about it. I'll put the link where you can buy the book from us in the chat at the side if you're interested. Also, at the end of the evening, we're going to do a question and answer period. So go ahead and type your questions in the chat, and Shelley will toss those over to Ashley. If you are having any technical problems, just tell me in the chat that you need some help, and I'll try to troubleshoot what you got going on. And we are also going to be giving away a copy of Answer Creek to one lucky winner at the end of the evening. So I'm very happy to introduce first Shelley, and then she's going to banter back and forth with Ashley. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Heidi. It's really a pleasure to be talking to you all through my favorite bookstore to one of my favorite historical novelists. It's just really a great confluence of really pretty cool, badass women, frankly. So thank you for giving me this chance to talk to you. Well, I know that I could do like a traditional introduction of Ashley, but I won't. I'll ask her a question that will lead to some of the more interesting, relevant parts of her background. I will say that that Ashley and I know each other because we share a publisher, Brooke Warner at She Writes Press, and that's been a way for me to meet so many novelists and memoirists whose work I really admire, and that's how Ashley and I found each other. And we've had several conversations on topics that fascinate both of us. And so that's part of why I'm really excited to talk to her tonight. I would like to give you a very short quote from a reader's review of Answer Creek, Ashley Sweeney's current novel, Answer Creek. And I think you'll see why I like this. Answer Creek is a tough read, but encourages readers to stick with it as strength of character, endurance, and hope for the future are welcome themes to the weary reader in our present world. And I think not only is that true for me because the ability to read into the past is so inviting with so much chaos going on today in our present. But also, many of the themes in Ashley's book speak directly to our needs, our human needs for surviving and thriving in the time that we are living in right now. This endurance, hope for the future. And we've talked an awful lot about resilience together, too. So maybe we'll have some discussion about that. So, with that in mind, I would like to ask my first question whether there is anything in your personal origin story, Ashley, that made Answer Creek the story that you needed to write.
Thanks, Shelley. And thank you so much, Heidi. And I'm so glad to see so many of my friends on. I feel like it's a organic conversation with you, even though we're not in the same living room together. So welcome. I love seeing your names there. Organic story. Well, my personal story is I was meant to write this book since the 4th grade. And I'll tell you why. You may remember, those of you who are about my age, in elementary school we had a biography section, and it was called the Landmark series. There was also the Signature series and the Famous Childhoods of Famous American series, and I lapped them up like a kitten with cream. I was a voracious reader from an early age. And those biographies, they filled so many of my nights in cold Long Island winters. And I absolutely loved those stories. So in 6th grade, I told my teacher, Paul Harron, that I was going to write a novel. I was convinced of it. I was 12. And even though it took about 40 more years for that to come true, I did everything that a budding novelist would want to do. I worked on school newspapers and literary magazines. I had a long career in journalism and then in education. And all the time I wrote poetry and I wrote articles for publication. And I had a stirring idea for a novel. I wanted to be a famous contemporary novelist. So I had an idea for a long time in mind about that. And then life happened, as it does to most of us, and I had a dramatic change in my life in the mid-2000s, which brought me to a place that I needed to confront. If I'm going to write, how am I going to do that? I really have to make this happen now. I'm in my late 50s, and I really need to make this happen. So I attended a lot of conferences and workshops and 2 master classes at Hedgebrook, which is a women's writing retreat center on Whidbey Island here in Washington. And during all of that time, I was waiting for an idea to find me. And an idea, in fact, did find me, and that was my first novel, Eliza Waite. For Answer Creek, there's another Genesis story for that, but we probably don't have time to go into that. But the basic question and answer, Shelley, is that I felt this really great weight to tell untold women's stories in the American West. And so that's where I've planted my feet, in historical fiction in the American West. And Answer Creek brings to you Ada Weeks, the only fictional character embedded into the Donner story. And the reason I called this talk 2,000 Miles in Borrowed Boots is because actually Ada did have borrowed boots in Answer Creek when her own boots became too ill for wear. She was able to borrow the boots of a man who died along the trail. And for many of you who might wonder, well, why would her boots wear out? It's a little known fact that the immigrants walked across this country. They didn't ride in wagons, as you see in Hollywood movies. They walked 2,000 miles to the left of their wagons and their teams. So every footfall was in a prairie dog hole or rattlesnake hole or sagebrush or scrambling on scree and rocks and mud and rivers. So Boots really took a beating, and she was very fortunate to be able to borrow those boots from Luke Halloran. And that is it's a seminal point in the book. I absolutely love that chapter. There's some chapters when you write that you love so much more than others, and that was one of the chapters that I absolutely loved writing.
I love the metaphor you brought up. That's more than a metaphor. It's, you know, part of the plot. But the borrowed boots, because it raises that question of when we're going to do some big, terrible, horrible, difficult thing, can we do it alone, or do we need to have some kind of communal response to it? Do we need each other? And I was just kind of wondering what you, I mean, there's a lot of both in your novel reflecting the Donner Party. You've got, you know, this iconic protagonist, Ada Weeks, who is an individual and does things for herself. But did you ever work out, or do you have a principle yourself about that rugged individual versus the communal effort?
That's a great question. Personally, I like to work my issues out myself, but there's one person on tonight who I won't mention, who has been a steadfast friend to me for many decades, and she has helped me through some very, very difficult times. So I don't know that you need a wide circle of friends or community to help you through a difficult time, but you definitely need at least one. And for Ada, her dearest friend, Eleanor Eddy, perishes at Donner Lake. And that is a very difficult moment for Ada. If she wasn't truly alone already, because she was orphaned twice, and she was taken on as a sort of a nanny with the Green family, she had really her first friend, and to lose that friend, I literally wept during that chapter, thinking if that was my friend who is on this broadcast tonight, if that had been her and I was cradling her head in my arms, it's very emotional to think that the person that you've entrusted so many of your secrets with, and who's held your hand when you needed it the most, that person would pass. So that was a very, very difficult scene for me to write as well.
Thank you for that. I'm also wondering, kind of piggybacking off of that, taking what you know from your personal life as well as what you know historically and through your research. And we'll talk literally about the research in just a minute. But I was wondering about how, having read Eliza Waite and now Answer Creek, you clearly like to put a young, heroic woman in very tight spots. And they're not in tight spots in the city. They're in nature, in the most demanding, rugged, impossible situations. So part of what I was wondering there, is there anything in your background, you know, that conveys your feeling about I mean, it's almost like Jack London books. You know what I mean? Like, they always put somebody struggling against nature. And you don't always have, I mean, I haven't read a lot of novels whose female protagonists are struggling in nature the way yours are. So could you tell us a little bit about where that comes from, and if this was more about research about these difficult physical settings, or if you know it personally?
Well, I was born in New York City, if that gives you a background of where I come from. And we didn't live like people live in the West, let alone people in the West in the 19th century. If you think of the physicality of what people in the 19th century had to do every morning put yourself in the place of a woman who would be getting up before dawn and having to cook 3 meals a day over a fire and walking 18 to 20 miles in the meantime and rearing children and perhaps having a child along the way. It's really mind-boggling. So I'm in awe of my protagonist, Shelley. That's the bottom line. And when you are a nascent author, one of the first rules that you're taught is to show, don't tell. And so I looked at the Donner story, and we're talking about a woman who has to battle weather and geography, time and distance, forces of nature. And I write in the present tense so that the reader feels that they're right there alongside of my characters. That's something that, two things won't change in any books that I write, that I will insert a fictional protagonist into a known era or story, and I will write in present tense. I've gotten flack about it, but it's my choice, and I'm sticking to it because I really love the feeling that you as a reader are walking right alongside of my protagonist and going through what she's going through at the same time. So I can do a short reading if you want, but we probably have so much to talk about that, you know, all of you can read for yourself. One thing that I was going to say about this is I use setting as a character. And so all of those elements that I just described to you, I have them as animate, not inanimate. And I use a lot of descriptors. I love adjectives. They're probably my favorite part of speech. And verbs are my second favorite part of speech. So if it's like chemistry. It comes from my poetic soul as starting as a poet, that language is very important to me. The story, of course, is the most important, but language, I really suffer over language. And so when I'm having my protagonist battle these elements, weather and geography and forces of nature and time and distance, I want to use the best words possible so that when you're coming along on that journey with me, you feel the cold and you're as wet as Ada is, and you're shivering when she's shivering at Donner Lake, when she's down to eating blankets and book covers and bone broth. So I want you to be right there in the story of these protagonists who I say I am really in awe of.
Would this be a good time for you to do a short reading, or would you rather postpone that or not do that?
Well, let's see if we have time at the end, because
Okay.
I have a lot to cover.
Okay, great.
Unless you're all just saying you really want to do that. We can.
Let's have some more questions then. And okay, great. So you were kind of leading into an area that I was interested in about the historical novel. As someone who's newly a historical novelist myself, it's like I had to invent every damn thing I did. You know what I mean? Like everything. There were 48 choices I had to make, and I had to make them wrong 3 times before I got the version I like. And one thing that you've mentioned that I'm very interested in, related to your style choice and the historical element, is that you set it in the past, but using the present tense, it does bring it alive. I'm wondering if you had any difficult troubles with any choices you had to make because it's set in history. Like, you know, even for instance, an example might be that I struggle in my book with how much to use dialect because I have characters with a particular accent. And when I fully did that accent, I got feedback, you know, you need to carve out about 9/10 of it because we get it just a little bit. what is your feeling about, making everything bound to the historical period or making it more contemporary?
Okay, I'll answer that question in two parts, Shelley. The first is, if you get me started on accuracy in historical fiction, we would be here for about 4 hours, because I am a stickler about accuracy, and that's why my novels take so long to write. The first novel took 8 years, the second one took 4 years, and I'm 2 years into my third manuscript. So it's going to be at least 3 years, maybe 4 years till it's published. So being a stickler for historical fiction is really something that I feel very strongly about. And as a little bit of an aside, you might find this to be a little bit odd, but I never fostered the belief of Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy with my own children. And you might think, oh, I might have robbed them of their childhood, but we explained about St. Nicholas and how he gave presents to the poor, and our children got plenty of presents, and they also gave presents through a program called the Angel Tree. And I taught them the Easter story as I know it through faith. And of course they got Easter baskets, but they didn't come from the Easter Bunny. And if they lost a tooth, I was married to a dentist at the time, they didn't come from the Tooth Fairy, they came from the Tooth Mommy. And so I felt in my own personal life that I didn't want to have to go back and undo these untruths that I had told to my children. And now I have 4 children, they're all adults, and they're all well adjusted, even though they didn't believe in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. And 2 of the 4 of them have told me at different times in their lives that, well, especially one told me that he would never have forgiven me if he had found out I had lied to him. So it's just really ingrained in me as a human, let alone as a writer. I want to do my homework, and I want the reader to trust me that I've done my homework, that you don't have to question any of my facts, because I've gone through those with a fine-tooth comb triple times. And so there is one minor error in Eliza Waite that a woman from Skagway brought up to me, and it's so minor that I think she's the only person who ever called me on it. Nobody's challenged me yet on Answer Creek. I'm not saying that they won't, and if there's an error, it's completely mine. I take full responsibility for that, but I really believe that the reader needs to trust the author about historical accuracy. So that's the answer to that part of the question.
A little crag in there that I find interesting, because it's something I've struggled with myself. What about the fact that Ada and Eliza are fictional characters within non-fictional history? So like, why not let your protagonist be one of the actual Donner Party? What did you gain in the writing of it by making the choices you did?
Right. Well, by inserting a fictional protagonist, I can create her story, I can create her biases, I can create her wants and her needs and her loves, and I don't have to butt up against a historical character. Those novelists who choose to write historical fiction through the eyes of a historical person, more power to him or her. It's not that I come in on one side of the coin or the other on that one, Shelley. It's just that it's my personal choice to take this character and insert her into a known event or error. And going back to the original question that you had asked on this, especially about language, the 19th century was full of very florid language, and I had to really hold myself back from using too much of that, the same as you might have had to do with dialect. you just put like a breadcrumb in every now and then to give people the hint, and then you continue on with basically contemporary language.
One of the things I really like about this novel is that it's a quest novel, really, and it moves across the United States. And I'm not sure if you do have a feeling about this, but do you think that there are characteristics of people who represent a region in this Donner Party? You know, is the region they're from controlling in any way how they react to events that the Donner Party face?
Well, let's look at history just of 1846 for just a second before I go into that question. For those of you who love history, or there's quite a few authors on tonight, the rabbit holes that we go down are half the fun while we're doing research. So I took the year 1846. That's the year that the Donners left from Illinois to Sacramento. And they thought it would be 5.5 months, but of course it took almost a year after their ordeal at Donner Lake over the winter of 1846 and 1847. But I love to see what else was happening at that time, because 1846 didn't just come in as a vacuum. I mean, that was the year that the first baseball game was played, and the AP, the Associated Press, was founded, and Buffalo Bill Cody was born. Those were some things that happened that year. The Liberty Bell cracked, and the saxophone was patented. Texas and Iowa were made into states, and the Smithsonian opened. Neptune was discovered. So all of these things are happening as this group of normal farmers and businessmen and their wives and children are parading across the country in covered wagons pulled by, you know, a double yoke of oxen. So they don't live in a vacuum, even though that story is so iconic. And that's one reason I took it on, actually. If I was going to take on a trail story, I decided to take on the most iconic trail story, because it was going to take me 2 to 4 years to write this novel. So that's a little background of 1846. So then we have this normal group of people, and I don't know, Heidi, if you have this book at your shop, but it's Michael Wallis, Wallis, The Best Land Under Heaven. This was my Bible as I wrote Answer Creek. It's a phenomenal narrative nonfiction by a well-known Western writer, Michael Wallis. I think it's his 18th book that he's written. I actually bought 2 copies, because one I wanted to just mark up and one I wanted to have as reference. And I love how he starts the book. This is, if I don't do my own reading, I'm going to just do one short reading here. He said, by the 1840s, despite the bounty harvested from the fertile Illinois soil, restlessness crept across the land. Mindful of the severe cholera epidemics and the lingering consequences of the financial panic of 1837, farmers, like so many more to come, were inspired also by the promise of a richer life. They had heard that call that swept across the nation as fast as prairie fire, clearly expressing the widely held belief that the United States had a mission to expand, to spread its form of government and the way of life across the continent. The catchphrase "Manifest Destiny" gave the movement a name. And so that's how the book opens, that there's a restlessness crept across the land. And I really get the shivers when I think about that line, and how 500,000 men and women and children picked up from their normal life wherever they lived before in the United States, which at that point only extended to the Mississippi River, and left overcrowded cities. Now, there were only 20 million people in America at that time, but the cities were dirty and overcrowded, and they were looking for a new life for themselves and for their children. It's not unlike immigrants today wanting to come to America. They're just looking for a better life for themselves and their children. That's the bottom line. But these people were people of means, and they had the money and the wherewithal to make this trip. It was a very expensive trip. It would take approximately 6 months of your wages to make that trip. So I'm not very good at math, but I used to make about $44,000 a year when I was an instructor at the community college. And so if I times that by 6, I'm over a couple $100,000 to make this trip across the country. So if you put it into those, with the lens of today, that it was a very expensive journey for these people. It's, as far as the Donner Party was concerned, most of you know the general story, but the saddest part is half of them perished. There were approximately 89 people on the journey. Some people left and some people joined. But at Donner Lake, 23 men died, 5 women died, and 14 children died. And that's very sobering that happened right where some of you go and spend your 4th of Julys now. That was the actual place that these men and women and children perished right there.
There's so much to say about what you've already said, including the fact that I love, the portion you read from the recommended book encourages people who read history to think about context and movements and general zeitgeist. And I really do often encourage my own students to try reading history, because historical writers do that, because we need to think that way now. Even in the world we're living right now, we need to be able to think about what is in the zeitgeist that makes current events happen as they do. But let's not do that. We have enough of that. I also was interested by the last thing you said. So we are one of those families that spends our 4th of July holiday with all our family friends at Donner Lake. That's what we do every year. And all the kids come back from all across the nation, wherever they're living, and we all stay together in houses right next to each other for the week of 4th of July. And we always take a little trek, hike over to the Donner Museum, look at all of those things, look at that great big statue right there. And so it kind of does, I always, all the kids have read all those books, all the parents have read all the, the Donner Party books. And I always feel a little creepy about it. And I wanted to ask you if you have a feeling for this. Readers are drawn to the cannibalism element of the Donner Party story. Do you have anything to say about that, about why we are drawn to that? What does it give us to read that or to consider it?
Yes, definitely. And as far as the cannibalism is, I couldn't negate it or ignore it in the story, because that's what you all know about the story. The bottom line is the cannibalism story. To dispel any rumors that you may have heard of the 89 people, it's widely documented that 4 of them were killed for their flesh. 2 of them were Native Americans who were killed, and 2 were young toddlers who were left at the lake. The rest of the deceased were buried under snow, and it wasn't until the immigrants were desperate that they descended onto the bodies of the dead. So I couldn't negate that, but what I attempted to do in the novel was to humanize the entire story. Instead of it being salacious, I wanted the story to be about people's humanity and what lengths people would go to survive. And we don't know. We can be righteous and say, oh, I would never do that. And in fact, while I wrote the novel, I have a scene where Ada is given a piece of dog meat, and it was her dog, and she says she won't eat it. And my editor said, "Are you kidding, Ashley? She's starving. She hasn't had anything to eat for months. She's going to eat the dog." So that really told me that I really don't know what I would do in a similar situation. I mean, for goodness sakes, I'm a vegetarian, but you never know what you would do in a situation where you're desperate. And so I wanted to show the immigrants' humanity. But to your other question, Shelley, as I said, the 19th century journalism was full of yellow journalism. Everything was sensational. And so it's nothing different than the National Enquirer, Hillary Clinton has a love child and Brad Pitt marries a secret heiress. Like we're just fascinated by this titillating information. And so while I was writing the novel, I'm no scientist and I'm not a social scientist either. I majored in English and history. But I did a lot of research about why people are drawn to horror. Because horror isn't my genre. I'm not trying to write horror, but there was an element of horror in Answer Creek. And there are 4 reasons that social scientists say. The first is our evolution, that our brains haven't really evolved past the hunter-gatherer stage. So when something new or frightening or different came into our lives, we had to respond to that. So our brains haven't really caught up with the centuries. So part of it's just built in. And the second is we get a dopamine rush when we pass an accident or if we hear some gossip. And that's a little drive that we get in our bodies if we hear some news, some salacious news. And another way to look at it is it's a catharsis. Like we read about somebody's bad news and we say, oh, well, they have it worse than we have it. Like I can breathe a sigh of relief now because my situation isn't that bad. And then the fourth one, this is the one that I found to be the most interesting. It said threatfulness outweighs trustworthiness. Someone's trying to call me, but I'm going to turn them off because they're not going to get me right now because I'm on with you. So threatfulness outweighs trustworthiness. And this one was the one that really hit home with me. It said that a person's estimation of trustworthiness is less tuned than a person's estimation of threatfulness. So we actually, as humans, have a finer categorization of potential enemies than we do of potential allies. And that was fascinating to me about how people were drawn to this story. It was splashed across papers across the United States, Shelley, and one account wanted to outdo the next one. So not only were they just dining on the dead, now they were like killing babies en masse so that they could feast on them. Each story was more horrendous than the next one. And that's why I have that scene where Ada says, I've got to write this story down because it's not being reported correctly by any stretch of the imagination. So if you put together 19th century journalism with the story of the Donner Party, that was ripe for headline news, breaking news in the 19th century.
And I also think it inspires quite a few 5th grade term papers currently.
One thing I do want to add though, Shelley, is for those of us who write fiction, nobody wants to read a story about a family who went on a picnic and they had a lovely day and the sun was shining and they took a boat ride out on the lake and they fell in love with each other and they were warm and happy and they went home and slept. Like, we want to know about the canoe that went over, or the bee stings that they all got, or the family argument that caused one person to leave the gathering in a huff. So as novelists, we're guilty of this too, but it's what readers crave. Readers aren't looking for a happy story necessarily. They're looking for a story with import and impact that might speak to something that they're going through in their lives. It's the same as if you turn on the news tonight, well, not tonight, because here you all are, instead of watching the president and the former vice president debate, you're here with me tonight and Shelley. So thank you for that. But if you watch the news, 80% of it is bad news. Only 20% of it, or what they put on at the end for the last 5 minutes for the fluff, is the good news. So our brains, the human brain, actually craves bad news. And that we have to take, especially now, you know, I've been really anxious lately, so, you know, I've been limiting my TV to an hour a day, and I've taken up Tai Chi, and, you know, I have herbal tea at night. So we all have to do things that, you know, lessen our own anxiety. And so that's just a personal choice. We can decide if we want to pick up a horror novel, or we can say, perhaps not tonight. So it comes down to a reader's choice.
You had mentioned earlier the word catharsis, and I'm going to come back to the other part of that, epiphany, in just a second. But what I would like to do first is to say, I have maybe 2 more questions. So I would love it if you all would type a question into the chat so that we can make sure that Ashley gets your questions answered. So I know I didn't ask what you wanted, so be sure to write it down, please. And meantime, so the thing about, you mentioned about catharsis. So like we see this horrible thing, we see this terrible scene or this period of time in the Donner Party's quest where they are brought so low and starving so badly. But then another thing, and it relieves something in us, almost like with catharsis, like almost like it says, it's true, things get bad, things can be horrible, people have terrible things like me or beyond what I had. So that part works. But also there's that kind of craving for epiphany. So like to understand, what does it mean that this is true? And so reading Answer Creek, and so aptly named Answer Creek, I can't help but wondering if in the course of your doing research, reflecting, writing this, if you had any sort of ultimate idea about what tells you or what predicts how a person will respond to the worst possible moment. Like, did you have a sense whether it was like just, you know, the survive, the thrive, the doing the right thing? Was it religion? Was it philosophy? Was it chemistry? What was it?
Well, earlier this fall, when we were on the panel for the Sacramento Public Library together, Shelley, we talked about resilience. And there is actually a scientific explanation. It's called the resilience theory. And it doesn't matter how horrendous a situation is, what's most important is how people cope with it and how they deal with it. And so there could have been elements of all of that. There were definitely a faithful people. They were definitely a gritty people. But it was more than individual survival here. With the Donner Party, it was about communal survival. And I had read during my research that there wasn't much visiting between the cabins, and that's where I placed Ada. She was the one who visited all of the cabins to see how everybody was doing. So we can't say that there wasn't somebody like that who was interested in the communal survival. because everybody was so down deep inside of themselves. In fact, it's curious, isn't it, that 4 times as many men died as women died, and they were strong and healthy. It was almost like they gave up. And the women had something to live for because most of them had children, and they did everything that they could do to survive, even though the very youngest of the children perished there at the lake. So there, but I wanted to write not only about the journey, but about the survivor guilt. So the Answer Creek section is definitely deals with survivor guilt. And whether or not we talk about the last chapter or not, or I don't want to really ruin it for people who haven't read it, but we're talking about how the experiences of our ancestors is built into our DNA. This is scientific. I'm not talking about some woo-woo science here. My ancestors in Ireland who survived the potato famines, that's all come down through my DNA about how I react in certain situations. And when I get back to Ireland again, which is the first place I'm going to go when we can travel safely again, I have a plan to go to where my great-grandmother lived before she came to the United States. And it very well might turn into a novel. I don't know. But I do know that I'm going to be reduced to tears there, Shelley, because I'm going to be standing on the land where my great-grandmother stood. And that's very powerful. So at the end of Answer Creek, you'll read about how we bridge generations. And I'm not talking about hearing voices here, but having a feeling inside of a very full feeling about how we connect with our grandmothers and great-grandmothers and great-grandmothers. It's to me at least, and I'm hoping for all of you too, that that's a very powerful experience.
That's gorgeous, Ashley. It makes me think of Joan Didion, who was, raised 2 blocks from where I live right now in Sacramento, went to middle school, where my boys went to middle school. She wrote a book called Where I Was From. And she wrote about this. She was related to the Reeds in the Donner Party. And so she wrote about how even the people who are related to the Donner Party, who don't know they're related to the Donner Party, are Donner Party members. That everyone living in this region, everyone who grew up with those stories, who feels like they have a part of this landscape in them, is dealing in one way or another, consciously or unconsciously, with that mythological story at this point. Yeah.
And even though Answer Creek is fictional, I have it as a tributary of the American River just about 3 miles west of Auburn. So my husband, who had done a lot of work down in the Sacramento area for his career as a fisheries biologist, we walked a lot of the creeks and rivers, and we went to a place where we designated that Answer Creek would have been. And of course, that's for the reader to decide. What were all the questions that Ada was asking that were fulfilled or not fulfilled at Answer Creek? And it also gave me the wonderful opportunity to create a secondary character named Riddle, who lives on Answer Creek and who intersects with Ada. You'll learn about Riddle. He's called the Man in the book, and you'll read about him before you ever know who he is or where they intersect. And then there's an aha moment where they meet, and then their story progresses from there. It's interesting that in Eliza and in Answer Creek, there is a love story element, but it's not a romance. It's an element of the story. In my third novel that I'm writing now, set in rural Arizona in 1905, the love element is not as evident, And in my next novel after that, which I've actually written but I've put aside, there is love and loss. So it's not that you're going to get the same thing from me every time. The ending isn't going to be the same, that somebody's going to meet somebody and, you know, their life is going to go on like that. It could be that they've met someone and they've lost that person, or they've never found someone to be with, male or female, and that's how they live out the rest of their days. So I don't want to be put in a niche there, but definitely there'll be more feisty protagonists in the West.
Oh, I love it. You know, and so that was, I'm not going to ask my last question because you sort of talked about it a little bit. Let's get to some of the items in the chat, but I was going to ask you, Ashley, if you could, if there's some kind of theme with love relationships in your books, but you did that a little bit. We had a few questions about your research. Could you say, I mean, there's a lot of writers out here. What is your strategy for doing research? How much of it is library, online? How much of it is physically visiting places? You know, anything like that?
It's a wide arc. I obviously know where I'm starting and where I'm ending before I start a novel. Those are the two things I know, where I'm starting and where I'm ending. I have no idea where the middle is going to take me. And so I embark usually on about 6 months of pure reading, and that can be library reading. I order a lot of used books for my research. I only buy new books for novels, but for research I buy used books. Then, of course, there's secondary internet research. And I start then and write the basic arc of the first draft, having had read about 6 months worth of research books and articles. Then I put XXX, that's my placeholder, where I want to come back and fill in the blanks of, you know, it's a killer to stop writing, to go look up when matchsticks were invented. Like, just put an XXX and come back to it later and find that out. You may find out that they haven't even been invented yet, and so then you have to rub sticks together. So there's a lot of surprises that come up, things that we assume, like I assumed that the Grimm's fairy tales had already been written, well, they hadn't. So there's things like that that we really have, that's what I mean about double and triple checking all of our facts. So after that, then the first draft is written. That's when I go visit the place where the novel takes place. So you might say, oh, well, why don't you set novels in Venice and New Zealand and you know, Greenland, you know, all these places you might want to have gone to, but I have to have I'm tethering myself to have some kind of connection to the American West. So if I can't make the connection, you know, I might just be visiting there for pleasure. So then after I've gone to the place, then I'm writing my second draft and I'm filling in a lot of the blanks. Then the third draft is written and I send it out to beta readers and they come back with a lot of information for me. And then the fourth draft isn't necessarily my final draft, but it's getting closer to my final draft. So there, and you can never finish researching. You finally have to just say, you know, my deadline is at 5 o'clock next Friday before I have to hit the final send button. That you have to stop at some point. I used to be a journalist and I worked for a weekly, a small town weekly. And when I felt like I had a master's degree in every subject that I had to write about. But when the deadline came, I had to push the button. Well, back in the day, I had to hand in the paper, but now I would have to hit the button. So you have to just know when is enough, but you never really finish, and it takes you down so many wonderful rabbit holes. I've learned so much about the Klondike Gold Rush doing Eliza and so much about the Donner Party and overland travel with Answer Creek. And now on the third novel, I'm learning so much about the Apache Wars and Arizona Territorial Legislature. So there's one I love. I'm sorry if you don't enjoy research, then maybe you shouldn't be doing historical fiction. But if you love doing research, it's such a joy.
I will just ask, we'll get to another question, but Heidi, would you mind choosing a winner of our drawings so that so that after we hear one or two more questions, we can draw a name for a free book? Thank you.
I've already got somebody.
Oh, great, good. So there's another question. You can tell this is a wonky crowd, a wonky writer crowd, because you have a question here, Ashley, about what is your system of, this is from Gretchen Charrington. With all that research done, how did you keep track of it all over a long period of time? Do you have a system? Do you have an app?
No, I have black and white composition notebooks and I number them. And so what I do is after, say I read a book, this is Answer Creek, but say this was one of my research books and I have all of these notes in it. Then what I do is I go to each one and I transpose all of those notes into a notebook. So there's a connection between reading something and writing something and remembering something. So I have them then, and it also is a way that I track all of the reference materials that I use, because in the back of the book I reference the ones that I've used the most. So I write all of those down per book and number the composition notebooks. And then that's a really fun part of the third draft, is when I input all of that knowledge. And so then I use a highlighter to see what I've used. And then later, probably very close to being finished, I go back through the notebooks to see if there's any other piece of information that I still want to put in there. I'm sure there are apps to do this, but I started writing poetry in composition notebooks in 1969, and I have so many of them in my life. It's like an old friend. In fact, I was at the grocery store the other day, and because a lot of school children didn't go back to school this year, there's a lot of school supplies. So they were selling the composition notebooks for 50 cents. So I bought a whole carton of them because I'll use them, and I really enjoy looking back at them even after I'm finished. It's very old school.
I think it's lovely and really fitting that a historical novelist will have a thing about artifacts, right? So, wow, Ashley, it's been so delightful hearing all the backstory of Answer Creek. And I think it'd be great if Heidi, who's our charming, beloved bookseller in Sacramento, would give us the results of the drawing. And I'll say, if you look in the chat, you're going to see the website for Capital Books. You know, the fact that these people host events like this all the time, spend their evenings doing this in support of readers and writers, and make these events free. You know, it'd be really nice for us all to go on there and buy a book tonight. So.
Well, I wanted to say that too, to thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. We're like double trouble here, Shelley. I wanted to thank Heidi so much, and to encourage you, if you have Answer Creek already, which many of you might, please order from the Capital Books website, because even if you don't live in the Sacramento area, Heidi's happy to ship to you. And the fall is coming and the holidays, and we have to keep our indie bookstores in business. So they're the heartbeat of our community, even if we can't be sitting there tonight all together. That please support Capital Books.
Well, thank you both for saying that. It's having these virtual events have been interesting. That it's been kind of a blessing in disguise in that we're able to reach a lot more people than, you know, if we were doing in-store events like we had been doing. So, you know, I remember from doing Shelley's event that we had somebody even outside of the country who tuned in at 2 in the morning because she wanted to see Shelley talk. And so even when COVID is finished and we're able to host in-store events again, we're going to continue on with this recorded platform, and so that we'll be able to reach everybody no matter where you live. So it's been kind of a silver lining in this really dark cloud we're all in. So with that, I'm going to announce the winner is Evelyn Latore. So
Right,
Evelyn, you will win a copy of Answer Creek. And for anybody who purchases from Capital Books, including Evelyn's copy, we will get, you'll get a signed version of it that Ashley will sign. So it's going to be extra special for you. But thank you, Shelley, for the amazing questions. It's always such a pleasure to work with you. And I could, you know, you're so close to me, I can almost throw a stone at your house. Someday we'll just have to get together and do these like together in the same room.
Yeah. Don't do that because there might be a virus on the stone. So.
Oh, true.
Well, thank you all so much. It's such a delight to be with readers and writers.
Yes.
Again.
Thank you very much. And Evelyn, I've got your address there. So actually I need the city. So if you want to email me at Heidi, HEIDI at capitalbooksonk.com if you need to give me any other information. Otherwise I'll just copy it down from the chat here. So anyway, have a great evening, everyone. And it was a pleasure to host this tonight. And thank you so much, Ashley. It was really enjoyable.
And it was very much worth it.
Yes. Some of you had to stay up late for this.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Hey.
Okay. Bye-bye.